Chapter 1. The Memory That Never Happened. There is a peculiar kind of fear that does not arrive suddenly. It emerges slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. A tiny feeling that something is wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not enough to disrupt ordinary life. Just enough to create discomfort. A word remembered differently. A familiar logo that suddenly appears altered. A movie quote everyone seems certain existed, yet somehow never did. Most people experience these moments casually. They laugh, correct themselves, move on. But occasionally, something stranger happens. Entire groups of people remember the same thing incorrectly. Not vaguely, not approximately, but with remarkable confidence. And when that occurs, reality itself begins to feel unstable. This phenomenon became known as the Mandela effect, named after one of the most famous examples. For years, thousands of people claimed to remember the death of Nelson Mandela occurring during the 1980s while he was still imprisoned. Some remembered televised funeral processions, news coverage, public mourning, speeches from political leaders. The memories often felt vivid and emotionally real. Yet according to documented history, Mandela did not die in prison. He was released in 1990, later became President of South Africa, and died decades afterward, in 2013. At first glance, the explanation seems simple. People misremember things constantly. Human memory is imperfect. Psychology has demonstrated this repeatedly. Witness testimony can become distorted. Details shift over time. The brain fills gaps automatically. And yet the Mandela effect feels emotionally different from ordinary forgetfulness. Because the memories involved often carry certainty, not hesitation. Not confusion. Certainty. People do not merely think they remember differently. They feel they remember differently. This distinction matters. Human beings rely heavily on memory to maintain a stable sense of reality. Memory tells us who we are, where we have been, what is real. Without reliable memory, personal identity itself begins to weaken. And perhaps this is why the Mandela effect unsettles people so deeply. It attacks something fundamental: trust in one's own mind. Across the internet, examples multiplied rapidly. People remembered the children's book series as the Berenstain Bears instead of the Berenstain Bears. They remembered famous movie quotes differently from their recorded versions. They remembered logos containing features that apparently never existed. Monopoly mascots with monocles. Brand names spelled incorrectly. Objects positioned differently. Entire scenes from films that seemed to vanish from reality itself. Each individual example appeared small, trivial, even. But together, they created an atmosphere of profound unease. Because the pattern suggested something psychologically disturbing. Large numbers of people sharing the same false memories. The internet intensified this effect dramatically. Before digital communication, most memory discrepancies remained private. A person might misremember something and quickly forget about it. But online communities allowed millions of people to compare memories instantly. And suddenly, isolated confusion became collective confusion. Thousands of strangers realizing they shared identical incorrect recollections. This transformed the Mandela effect from psychological curiosity into modern mythology. Soon, explanations began multiplying. Psychologists pointed toward well-documented flaws in human memory. Pattern recognition errors, social reinforcement, confabulation, the brain reconstructing memories imperfectly over time. These explanations remain scientifically persuasive. And yet, for many people, they feel emotionally incomplete. Because the Mandela effect does not merely feel like forgetfulness. It feels like displacement. Like waking up into a world subtly different from the one remembered. Not dramatically altered. Just slightly wrong. And perhaps that subtlety is what makes the phenomenon so unsettling. Reality remains mostly intact. The world still functions normally. But tiny details appear shifted sideways. Enough to trigger doubt. Not only about memory, but about reality itself. Over time, stranger theories emerged. Some proposed parallel universes, alternate timelines colliding, quantum instability. Others connected the phenomenon to scientific experiments, technological change, or cosmic anomalies. Most of these theories remain speculative and unsupported scientifically, but their popularity reveals something important. Modern people are increasingly uncomfortable with uncertainty, especially uncertainty involving perception itself. The human brain desperately wants coherence, a stable narrative, a predictable world. When memory fractures, even slightly, the mind begins searching for explanations powerful enough to restore order. And sometimes ordinary psychological explanations feel emotionally insufficient, especially when the memories feel vivid, emotional, personal. There is another reason the Mandela effect resonates so strongly today. Modern civilization already feels unstable in many ways. Information changes constantly. Media manipulates perception. Digital reality blurs with physical reality. Images are edited. Videos fabricated. Facts disputed endlessly online. Many people already feel uncertain about what can truly be trusted. The Mandela effect enters this atmosphere like gasoline touching fire, because it transforms abstract uncertainty into intimate uncertainty. Now the instability exists not only in politics or media, but inside memory itself, inside the mind. This creates a uniquely modern form of horror. Not monsters, not ghosts, but the possibility that reality may be less fixed than we assume. Or worse, that human consciousness may be fundamentally unreliable. And perhaps that possibility frightens people more deeply than they realize. Because memory is not simply storage. Memory is continuity, the thread connecting past and present. Without it, the self begins dissolving. Perhaps that is why conversations about the Mandela effect often become strangely emotional. People defend their memories passionately, almost defensively. Because challenging memory can feel like challenging identity itself. The debate stops being about logos or movie quotes. It becomes existential. Can the mind be trusted? Can consensus reality be trusted? Or are human beings constructing reality constantly from unstable fragments? Tonight, we begin exploring that question. Not to prove alternate universes, not to dismiss psychology, but to enter the strange territory where memory, perception, identity, and reality begin overlapping in unsettling ways. A world where millions of people remember things that never happened. Or perhaps, a world where reality itself is not as stable as it appears. Chapter 2. The funeral the world remembers. There are memories people forget gradually, and there are memories that refuse to disappear. The strange thing about the Mandela effect is not that people remember details incorrectly. Human beings have always done that. The strange thing is how many people remember the same impossible event with extraordinary clarity. The story that gave the phenomenon its name remains one of the most unsettling examples. For years, Thousands of people insisted they remembered the death of Nelson Mandela occurring sometime during the 1980s. Not vaguely, not uncertainly. They remembered news broadcasts, funeral coverage, crowds mourning in the streets. Some even recalled speeches from political figures and Mandela's widow speaking publicly after his death. The memories often carried emotional texture. That is what makes the phenomenon difficult to dismiss casually. False memories are usually fragmented, unstable, dreamlike, but many Mandela effect memories feel unusually complete, almost anchored. As though they belong to a real timeline the mind refuses to release. And then came the disturbing realization. According to recorded history, none of it happened. Mandela remained alive for decades after the memories people described. He was released from prison in 1990, became president of South Africa, appeared publicly for years, and eventually died in 2013. Yet even after his actual death, people continued insisting they remembered a completely different version of events. This was not one isolated individual misremembering history. It was collective. Large groups of strangers sharing remarkably similar recollections. And perhaps that is where the real unease begins. Because human memory is suggestible. But synchronized false memory on this scale feels different. Psychologists argue that the phenomenon emerges through social reinforcement and cognitive reconstruction. One person remembers incorrectly. Others adopt similar distortions unconsciously. Over time, collective certainty forms around something that never occurred. Scientifically, this explanation sounds reasonable. But emotionally, many people feel it leaves something unanswered. Why this specific memory? Why such vivid emotional consistency? And why do so many people describe the exact same atmosphere surrounding the event? The deeper researchers looked into the Mandela effect, the stranger the pattern became. Again and again, groups of people appeared to remember alternate versions of reality. Not random mistakes, specific alternate details. And often, the incorrect memory somehow felt more natural than the official version. That detail matters, because many Mandela effect examples do not feel like ordinary confusion. They feel like corrections, as though reality itself has been altered slightly, leaving behind fragments of previous memory. Over time, internet communities became filled with people describing an identical sensation, not simply remembering differently, but feeling displaced. Like waking into a world almost identical to the one they knew, except for tiny impossible changes. A logo altered, a word spelled differently, a famous line from a film subtly rewritten. Small details, yet emotionally disturbing details. Because reality remained close enough to normal that the changes became difficult to explain away psychologically. If everything changed completely, people would assume madness immediately. But the Mandela effect operates differently. The world remains stable. Only fragments shift, like edits made carefully inside a familiar dream. Some researchers and theorists began asking uncomfortable questions. What if memory is not failing? What if memory is surviving? The idea sounds absurd initially, yet once introduced, it becomes strangely difficult to forget, especially for people who have experienced strong Mandela effect memories personally. The theory evolved gradually online. Parallel timelines, reality shifts, dimensional overlap. According to these ideas, certain individuals may retain fragments of memory from alternate versions of history. Most scientists reject such theories completely. There is no accepted evidence proving parallel timelines interact with human consciousness in this way. And yet the theories continue spreading, not because they are scientifically established, but because they feel emotionally persuasive. They explain the sensation people describe, that uncanny feeling that reality itself has drifted sideways. Even stranger, some Mandela effect cases appear connected to highly emotional cultural memories, famous deaths, childhood books, beloved movies, shared symbols. It is almost as though the phenomenon targets emotionally anchored areas of collective consciousness, the very places where memory should feel strongest. And when those memories become unstable, people experience something close to existential vertigo. If memory can betray us here, where else can it betray us? This question grows darker the longer one thinks about it, because human beings rely on continuity to maintain psychological stability. We trust that yesterday connects cleanly to today. We trust that the world remains fundamentally consistent. The Mandela effect quietly attacks that trust, not violently, subtly, a tiny fracture in the structure of certainty. There is another unsettling aspect rarely discussed openly. Many people encounter the Mandela effect during periods of emotional transition, isolation, stress, sleeplessness, moments when reality already feels psychologically unstable. Some report the experience almost like waking from a dream that never fully ended. Others describe an overwhelming feeling that something changed in the world around a certain point in time. That reality somehow feels thinner now, less solid than it once did. Official explanations dismiss these sensations as cognitive bias and pattern recognition. And perhaps sometimes they are. But the emotional intensity surrounding the Mandela effect suggests something deeper may be happening psychologically, or possibly even culturally, because modern civilization itself increasingly resembles a shifting reality. Digital media alters perception constantly. Information changes overnight. Images can be fabricated instantly. Artificial intelligence generates realistic speech and faces. The line separating memory from constructed reality becomes weaker every year. In such an environment, the Mandela effect stops feeling impossible. It begins feeling almost inevitable, a symptom of a civilization losing confidence in objective reality itself. And perhaps that is why the phenomenon spreads so explosively online. Not merely because people enjoy mysteries, but because millions already sense something unsettling beneath modern life. The feeling that reality has become unstable. That truth changes too easily. That memory no longer guarantees certainty. The funeral of Nelson Mandela became the symbolic center of that fear, a memory the world insists never happened. And yet thousands continue remembering it vividly. Not like imagination, not like confusion, but like history. History from somewhere else. Or perhaps, from a version of reality that no longer exists. Chapter 3. The Children's Books That Changed. At first, the Mandela effect seemed connected mostly to famous events, historical figures, movie quotes, public memories shared across generations. But then people began noticing something stranger. The phenomenon was appearing inside childhood itself. And that changed everything. Because childhood memories occupy a different place in the human mind. They are emotionally rooted, repeated thousands of times, attached to comfort, familiarity, and identity. People may misremember random details from adulthood, but the books, cartoons, and symbols encountered repeatedly during childhood tend to feel permanent, stable, almost untouchable, which is why one particular example became impossible for many people to ignore. the children's book series known officially as the Berenstain Bears. Or at least, that is what reality currently says. For millions of people, the name feels wrong immediately. Not unfamiliar. Wrong. They remember the Berenstain Bears, spelled with an EIN, not AIN. The distinction seems tiny, almost meaningless, yet the emotional reaction surrounding it became enormous, because people did not merely suspect the spelling had changed. They felt certain it had once been different. Parents remembered reading the books aloud. Children remembered seeing the title on classroom shelves. The pronunciation itself seemed to support the remembered spelling naturally. Berenstain, not Berenstain. And perhaps most unsettling of all, many people encountered the official spelling only later in life and experienced genuine shock. Not mild confusion. Shock. As though reality itself had quietly rewritten something fundamental. This emotional intensity is what separates the Mandela effect from ordinary mistakes. People are not simply surprised. They often feel disturbed. Some even describe a brief sensation of disorientation, like recognizing that the world no longer matches memory exactly. The internet amplified the phenomenon dramatically. Forums filled with identical reactions. Thousands of strangers independently expressing the same disbelief. How was it always Berenstain? That doesn't look right. I know what I remember. Again and again, the same language appeared. Not uncertainty. Certainty. Psychologists explain the phenomenon through pattern familiarity. Names ending in Stein are far more common than Stain, especially in Western culture. The brain naturally corrects unfamiliar structures into recognizable ones. Scientifically, this explanation makes sense. But emotionally, it feels incomplete to many people, because the memory often carries visual clarity. People do not merely remember hearing the word differently. They remember seeing it differently, repeatedly, across years of childhood. And the Berenstain case was only the beginning. Soon, other childhood memories began surfacing. Curious George, the Monopoly Man, Pikachu, Looney Tunes, classic Disney scenes. Again and again, people remembered details that apparently never existed. A monkey with no tail remembered as having one. A monocle remembered on a mascot who never wore one. Words spelled differently. Objects positioned differently. Entire visual impressions altered. Individually, each example appeared trivial. Collectively, they became deeply unsettling, because together they created a pattern. Not random forgetting. Structured alternate memory. And perhaps most disturbing of all, many Mandela effect memories seem to follow a strange logic. The remembered version often feels more natural than the official one, almost as though reality has become less coherent after the change. This detail fascinates many researchers. If the phenomenon were purely random memory failure, why would millions of people drift toward the exact same alternative versions? Why not infinite variations? Why the same ones repeatedly? Some theorists propose that the Mandela effect reflects overlap between parallel realities. Tiny fractures where neighboring timelines bleed into one another. Most people dismiss such theories immediately. Yet once someone experiences a powerful Mandela effect personally, dismissal becomes harder, because the emotional certainty feels real. That is what outsiders often fail to understand. The Mandela effect is not persuasive because of evidence alone. It is persuasive because of feeling. The feeling that memory is anchored to something authentic, something lived. And when reality contradicts that memory, the contradiction feels profoundly wrong, almost violating, especially when tied to childhood. Childhood memories form the architecture of personal identity. The books we read, the cartoons we watched, the logos and symbols surrounding early life. These become psychological landmarks. When those landmarks appear altered, even slightly, people experience an unsettling sensation difficult to describe fully, as though the past itself has shifted. Some people respond with curiosity, others with anxiety, and a surprising number become obsessed, endlessly searching old photographs, VHS tapes, archived advertisements, and forgotten merchandise, hunting for evidence that the remembered world once existed. Sometimes they discover strange inconsistencies. Old knockoff products using alternate spellings, vintage merchandise appearing contradictory, fragments that seem to support the remembered versions partially. These discoveries only deepen the mystery emotionally, because they create ambiguity, not enough to prove alternate realities, but enough to prevent certainty from returning completely. There is also another layer to the phenomenon. The Mandela effect emerged alongside the digital age. As humanity transitioned into a world dominated by screens, algorithms, and constantly shifting information, older generations grew up with physical objects, printed books, fixed media, stable references. Then suddenly, reality became editable. Search engines updated information instantly. Digital archives changed silently. Media could be altered retroactively without physical evidence remaining. For the first time in history, ordinary people lived inside a reality capable of changing invisibly. Perhaps this technological transition intensified the psychological conditions necessary for the Mandela effect to spread, because modern people already feel uncertain about permanence, about authenticity, about whether anything remains fixed. In such an environment, alternate memory begins feeling strangely plausible, especially when shared collectively. The Berenstain Bears became more than a spelling debate. It became symbolic, a tiny fracture revealing something larger beneath modern consciousness. The possibility that memory is not as reliable as we believed, or perhaps even more disturbing, that reality itself may not be entirely stable. Tonight, somewhere in old attics and forgotten classrooms, copies of those children's books still exist quietly on dusty shelves, their covers unchanged, their titles fixed in ink, and yet millions continue looking at them with the same strange feeling. The feeling that something subtle has shifted, something impossible to prove completely, but impossible to forget once noticed. A tiny alteration in the fabric of memory itself, or perhaps a trace left behind from another version of the world. Chapter 4. The Brain That Rewrites Reality. There is something deeply unsettling about discovering that memory is not a recording. Most people move through life believing the mind functions like an archive. Events happen. The brain stores them. Later, those memories are retrieved unchanged, stable, reliable, permanent. But neuroscience paints a far stranger picture. Memory is not playback. It is reconstruction. Every time a person remembers something, the brain rebuilds the memory from fragments, images, emotions, associations, meaning. And during that reconstruction, subtle alterations can occur. Tiny edits, tiny distortions, usually unnoticed, usually harmless. But once people begin studying memory closely, an uncomfortable realization emerges. Human beings may be rewriting reality inside their own minds constantly. This is where the Mandela effect becomes truly disturbing, because it exists precisely at the intersection between memory and certainty. People do not merely remember differently. They remember confidently, emotionally, sometimes even defensively. And confidence in memory turns out to be surprisingly unreliable. Psychologists have demonstrated this repeatedly through experiments involving eyewitness testimony. Entire groups of people can remember events that never occurred. False details can be implanted through suggestion alone. Even vivid emotional memories may contain major inaccuracies. In one famous series of studies, participants became convinced they had experienced childhood events completely invented by researchers. The memories felt authentic, personal, real, and perhaps that is the most frightening aspect of all. The brain does not clearly distinguish between genuine memory and reconstructed narrative once emotional certainty forms around it. Reality becomes story, and story becomes reality. Yet the Mandela effect still feels different from ordinary false memory, because the errors often appear strangely synchronized. Large numbers of people arriving at identical alternate recollections independently. Again and again, the same patterns emerge. The same movie quotes remembered incorrectly. The same logos altered in memory. The same childhood details shared by strangers across different countries and generations. Coincidence alone begins feeling emotionally insufficient. This is why the Mandela effect fascinates not only conspiracy theorists, but also psychologists, neuroscientists, philosophers, and cultural researchers. The phenomenon exposes something fragile beneath modern consciousness: the possibility that human perception depends far more heavily on collective reinforcement than most people realize. In many ways, reality itself may function socially. People trust memories partly because others confirm them. When enough individuals agree on something, certainty strengthens. But what happens when large groups agree on something objectively incorrect? The answer becomes psychologically destabilizing. Consensus itself begins losing authority. And once consensus weakens, reality starts feeling negotiable. There is another layer to this phenomenon rarely discussed openly. The brain appears designed less for accuracy than for coherence. This distinction matters enormously. Human memory prioritizes meaning over precision, narrative over detail. The mind wants stories that feel emotionally complete. And sometimes, emotionally complete memories become more persuasive than factual ones. This may explain why many Mandela effect examples follow intuitive logic. The remembered versions often feel cleaner, more natural, more culturally expected. The brain unconsciously reshapes information into forms that feel psychologically satisfying. Yet this explanation does not fully eliminate the unease, because the Mandela effect forces people into direct confrontation with the instability of perception itself. Most individuals assume consciousness provides reliable access to reality. The phenomenon quietly suggests otherwise. Perhaps people are not experiencing the world directly at all. Perhaps the brain constantly edits, filters, simplifies, and reconstructs reality into something manageable. If that is true, then ordinary life may already exist inside a kind of controlled hallucination. Not false, but interpreted. This idea has become increasingly influential in modern neuroscience. Researchers now understand that perception itself involves prediction. The brain does not passively receive reality. It actively constructs it. Sensory information arrives incomplete, and the mind fills gaps automatically using expectation, memory, and prior experience. In other words, human beings do not merely observe reality. They generate it internally. This realization changes the Mandela effect completely. The phenomenon no longer appears as simple forgetfulness. Instead, it becomes evidence of how fragile consensus reality may truly be, especially within a civilization increasingly dominated by media and digital information. Because modern people rarely experience reality directly anymore. Most knowledge arrives through screens, edited images, curated narratives, algorithms deciding what individuals see and remember. Human memory evolved for physical survival in natural environments, not for navigating endless streams of manipulated digital information. Perhaps the Mandela effect emerged precisely because the human brain is struggling to adapt. The internet accelerated this process dramatically. Before digital culture, memory discrepancies often disappeared quietly. A person misremembered something and moved on. Now millions compare memories instantly online. False recollections become reinforced socially. Communities form around alternate versions of reality, and the emotional certainty grows stronger through repetition. This creates feedback loops difficult to separate from genuine experience. Yet even knowing all of this, the unease remains. Because understanding memory scientifically does not fully protect people emotionally. The feeling persists. That strange sensation that something is slightly wrong with reality itself. Some researchers believe the Mandela effect reveals a deeper existential fear within modern society. The fear that identity may not be stable. After all, human beings are constructed largely from memory. Remove memory, and the self begins dissolving. Alter memory, and identity shifts alongside it. If collective memory can become distorted so easily, then perhaps entire cultures can drift away from objective reality without noticing. This possibility becomes especially disturbing in the digital age. Deepfake videos, artificial intelligence, synthetic voices, edited archives. History itself increasingly feels editable, fluid, unstable. The Mandela effect may represent more than a psychological curiosity. It may be an early symptom of something larger. A civilization entering an era where reality itself becomes difficult to anchor. And perhaps that is why the phenomenon spread so effectively during late-night conversations, online forums, and quiet moments alone. Because deep down, many people already suspect something unsettling. That consciousness may not function as a window onto reality, but as a storyteller endlessly rewriting the world inside the darkness of the human mind. A storyteller so convincing that most of the time, no one notices the edits being made. Chapter 5. The logos that were never there. Most people do not notice logos consciously. They pass through daily life like background architecture, on cereal boxes, billboards, television commercials, children's toys, fast food signs glowing quietly beside highways at night. Logos become embedded deep within memory through repetition, not once or twice, but thousands of times across entire lifetimes. Which is why the Mandela effect surrounding famous logos feels so disturbing. Because people are not remembering obscure details from forgotten products. They are remembering symbols they encountered constantly. And somehow, those symbols no longer match reality. One of the most famous examples involves the Monopoly mascot. For countless people, the image feels immediate and unquestionable. An elderly man with a top hat, white mustache, and a monocle. Except according to official history, the monocle never existed. The character known as Rich Uncle Pennybags has apparently never worn one at all. At first, most people react with disbelief, then confusion, then that familiar unsettling feeling. because the monocle does not merely seem possible. It seems obvious. People can picture it clearly. Many would swear they saw it repeatedly throughout childhood. And yet every official image says otherwise. The explanation offered by psychologists sounds reasonable enough. The brain associates wealthy old-fashioned characters with monocles because of cultural stereotypes. Mr. Peanut wears one. Old aristocratic figures in films often wear them. The mind unconsciously blends familiar visual archetypes together. Scientifically, the explanation works. Emotionally, however, it leaves behind residue, because the remembered image still feels more real than the official one. Again and again, this pattern appears within Mandela effect cases. The alternate memory feels strangely correct. Not random, not chaotic. Correct. Another famous example involves the logo for Fruit of the Loom. Thousands of people remember a cornucopia behind the fruit in the logo, a woven horn-shaped basket associated with harvest imagery. The memory feels vivid for many individuals because the logo supposedly taught them what a cornucopia even was as children. And yet, according to official records, the cornucopia never existed. The fruit was always displayed alone. This case became especially unsettling because the memory carries educational context. People remember learning from it, noticing it, discussing it. Some even found old artwork and parody images referencing the cornucopia independently, as though traces of the remembered version survive culturally. No definitive proof emerged, but the ambiguity deepened the mystery. The same phenomenon repeated across countless brands and symbols. The spelling of Kit Kat, the positioning of objects in famous logos, missing hyphens, altered colors, tiny visual shifts impossible to fully explain emotionally. Individually, they appear insignificant. Collectively, they begin feeling systematic, like small edits made quietly beneath the surface of reality. There is something psychologically intimate about logos. Unlike historical facts or political events, logos enter memory passively, repeatedly, subconsciously. People trust those memories precisely because they never tried to memorize them actively. The symbols simply became part of the visual environment. And when those familiar patterns suddenly appear altered, the effect feels strangely invasive, almost personal, as though reality itself has tampered with unconscious memory. The internet transformed these experiences into mass phenomena. Millions of people compared recollections instantly. Forums filled with identical reactions. I know there was a monocle. I remember the cornucopia. That logo looks wrong now. The emotional language remained remarkably consistent. Not uncertainty, recognition, a feeling of displacement, as though people were remembering fragments from a slightly different version of the world. Some theorists began proposing increasingly radical explanations: parallel timelines, dimensional shifts, quantum instability affecting collective memory. Official science rejects these ideas almost universally. Yet the theories continued spreading because the emotional experience itself felt difficult to dismiss, especially for individuals encountering multiple Mandela effects simultaneously. One altered logo might feel explainable. Dozens begin creating cumulative unease. This cumulative effect matters psychologically. The Mandela effect rarely convinces people through one example alone. It works through accumulation, tiny inconsistencies stacking upon one another until certainty begins weakening. And once certainty weakens, perception itself starts feeling unstable. There is another reason logo-based Mandela effects resonate so deeply. Modern civilization already lives inside a world dominated by symbols. Corporate imagery surrounds daily existence constantly. Brands shape identity, memory, and emotion more than most people consciously realize. People form emotional relationships with symbols encountered repeatedly throughout life. The logos become anchors, stable visual landmarks inside memory. When those landmarks appear altered, the subconscious reacts strongly, almost like noticing that familiar streets have changed overnight while no one else seems concerned. Some researchers believe the phenomenon reflects the increasing fragmentation of modern consciousness. Digital life exposes people to endless streams of rapidly changing visual information. Attention becomes fractured, memory less stable, perception more vulnerable to suggestion. Perhaps the Mandela effect represents a side effect of this transformation. A civilization overwhelmed by symbols losing confidence in its own memory structures. And yet that explanation still fails to fully eliminate the eerie emotional atmosphere surrounding certain cases. Because some memories feel too specific, too emotionally rooted, too widely shared. The monocle, the cornucopia, the altered spellings. Again and again, people experience the same quiet shock upon discovering reality does not match memory. And perhaps the most unsettling part is how small the changes are. The world remains mostly identical. No major laws of physics altered. No dramatic historical rewrites. Only tiny shifts. Tiny edits. Like imperfections appearing slowly inside a dream. Maybe that subtlety is precisely what makes the Mandela effect so psychologically effective. Reality changes just enough to create doubt, but not enough to destroy the illusion completely. And somewhere beneath those altered logos and missing details lies a darker question many people try not to ask directly. If reality can change in ways so small we barely notice, how would we recognize larger changes if they ever happened? Or perhaps more disturbingly, what else have we already forgotten that the world once looked different? Chapter 6. The movie quotes everyone remembers. Some memories feel larger than memory itself. They become cultural landmarks, repeated endlessly through conversation, television, parody, and imitation until they seem impossible to forget incorrectly. Movie quotes belong to this category. People remember them not once, but thousands of times, repeated across decades, across generations, across entire cultures, which is why the Mandela effect surrounding famous film lines feels especially disturbing. Because in many cases, millions of people remember the exact same quote, and the quote apparently never existed. Perhaps the most famous example comes from Star Wars, Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back. Ask almost anyone to imitate the iconic revelation scene involving Darth Vader, and they will say the same line. "Luke, I am your father." The phrase feels embedded permanently in global culture. Except according to the actual film, the line is different. Vader never says Luke. The real line is, "No, I am your father." When people first discover this, the reaction is often immediate disbelief. Not because the difference is large, but because the remembered version feels so absolute. People can hear it in their minds clearly. Many would swear under oath that the word Luke existed in the original scene, and yet it does not. Official explanations argue that the altered version spread naturally because it provides clearer context when quoted outside the film. Without Luke, the line becomes ambiguous during casual conversation. Over time, culture collectively reshaped the quote into a more recognizable form. Again, scientifically, the explanation makes sense. Yet emotionally, the effect remains strangely powerful, because the remembered version often feels older than the correction itself, as though the quote truly existed once and was somehow replaced later. The same phenomenon appears repeatedly across cinema history. In Casablanca, millions remember the line, "Play it again, Sam." But the exact phrase never appears in the film. In Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, people remember, "Mirror, mirror on the wall." Yet the official line is, "Magic mirror on the wall." Again and again, reality diverges slightly from collective memory, and always in the same direction. The altered versions feel cleaner, more natural, more culturally complete. This pattern fascinates researchers because it suggests the brain may unconsciously optimize memory for narrative coherence. The mind reshapes information into forms easier to remember and repeat. Yet the Mandela effect refuses to remain emotionally simple, because the memories involved often carry extraordinary certainty. Some people report rewatching scenes repeatedly throughout childhood and still remembering lines that officially never existed. Others describe discovering the correct versions and feeling genuine psychological discomfort afterward. Not confusion, discomfort, as though reality itself has become subtly unreliable. This emotional response matters, because film occupies a unique psychological space within human culture. Movies are not merely entertainment. They become part of identity. People connect films to childhood, relationships, family memories, emotional milestones. A famous quote repeated across decades becomes woven into personal history itself. And when reality suddenly contradicts those memories, the contradiction feels intimate, almost invasive. There is also another layer to these Mandela effects. Cinema already exists in a liminal space between reality and illusion. Actors portraying fictional lives, artificial worlds designed to feel emotionally authentic. Entire generations emotionally shaped by scenes that never truly happened. Perhaps this makes movie-related Mandela effects especially effective psychologically, because films already blur the boundary between memory and imagination. The mind stores cinematic memories differently from ordinary experience, sometimes more vividly, sometimes more emotionally, and over time, repeated exposure through parody and cultural repetition may strengthen alternate versions more powerfully than the originals themselves. But again, the scale of synchronization remains unsettling. Millions arriving at the same incorrect recollections independently. Not random distortions. Specific alternate versions shared collectively. This is where many Mandela effect discussions become darker. Some theorists argue that the phenomenon reveals instability within reality itself. Not merely memory distortion, but subtle alterations in the structure of history. Tiny changes leaving behind psychological residue in human consciousness. Fragments of previous timelines surviving inside memory. Official science dismisses such ideas completely. Yet the theories continue spreading because they resonate emotionally with modern experience. After all, reality already feels increasingly unstable in the digital age. Movies themselves change retroactively now. Streaming platforms edit scenes silently. Music licenses alter soundtracks. Special editions replace originals. Digital archives update endlessly without physical permanence. Modern people increasingly live inside media that can change invisibly overnight. Perhaps this technological environment has conditioned society to feel that reality itself is editable, mutable, unfixed. And the Mandela effect amplifies that fear dramatically, because it suggests the edits may already be happening, quietly, subtly, without announcement. There is another unsettling detail surrounding movie quote Mandela effects. Many people first discover the discrepancies late at night, watching old clips online, revisiting childhood films, alone with memory, and the experience often carries an almost dreamlike quality, a strange dissociation. The scene appears familiar, yet wrong, like returning to a childhood home and finding the furniture slightly rearranged. Nothing major changed, but enough changed to create unease. Some researchers believe these experiences reveal how heavily identity depends upon narrative continuity. Human beings understand life through remembered stories. Films become part of those stories. Shared cultural mythology. When famous lines shift unexpectedly, even in small ways, the stability of collective memory weakens slightly. And once memory weakens, reality itself begins feeling negotiable. Perhaps that is why Mandela effect discussions rarely stay trivial for long. People begin with movie quotes and logos, but eventually arrive somewhere much darker. Questions about consciousness, reality, identity, the possibility that human beings may not remember the world as accurately as they believe, or perhaps the possibility that the world itself is not remaining entirely the same. Tonight, somewhere in the darkness, millions of people still remember lines that were never spoken, scenes that never happened exactly that way, words permanently etched into memory despite existing nowhere in recorded reality. And perhaps the strangest part of all is how real those impossible memories still feel. Chapter 7. The Internet opened the door. Before the Internet, strange memories usually disappeared quietly. A person misremembered something. A friend corrected them. Life continued. The uncertainty dissolved almost immediately. But the digital age changed something fundamental about human consciousness. For the first time in history, millions of people could compare memories instantly across continents. And once that became possible, the Mandela effect exploded. What had once been isolated confusion transformed into collective mystery. People sitting alone late at night began typing strange questions into search engines. Did the Monopoly man have a monocle? Was it Berenstain or Berenstain? Why do I remember this differently? And then came the shock. Thousands of others remembered exactly the same thing. Not approximately. Exactly. The Internet created something unprecedented. Mass synchronization of uncertainty. Forums filled with identical reactions. People who had never met, raised in different countries and generations, describing the same alternate memories with almost eerie consistency. That detail changed the psychological atmosphere completely, because private doubts suddenly became collective validation. And collective validation is powerful. Human beings trust memories more when others confirm them. Once large online communities formed around shared Mandela effects, the phenomenon gained emotional momentum impossible to stop. The Internet did not merely spread the Mandela effect. In many ways, it created the modern version of it entirely. There is something uniquely unsettling about discovering strangers share the exact memory you thought was impossible. The experience creates instant emotional reinforcement, a feeling that something larger may be happening, something beyond ordinary forgetfulness. And once people experience that feeling, they often begin noticing Mandela effects everywhere. One discrepancy leads to another, then another. Soon reality itself begins feeling unstable. This cumulative effect became one of the defining psychological features of online Mandela effect culture. The phenomenon spreads like a crack in certainty, small at first, then widening gradually. The digital world amplified this process through algorithms designed to reward emotional engagement. Mystery spreads rapidly online, especially mysteries involving identity, memory, and hidden reality. Videos discussing Mandela effects accumulated millions of views. Forums became archives of alternate recollections. Entire communities formed around the belief that reality itself had shifted. Some discussions remained psychological. Others became deeply philosophical. And some entered far stranger territory. Parallel universes, timeline collapses, dimensional merging, simulation theory. The internet allowed all these ideas to evolve together inside a single ecosystem of collective uncertainty. And perhaps that environment mattered more than people realized. Because human perception is deeply social. The brain constantly calibrates reality using the reactions of others. In physical communities, this process happens slowly and locally. Online, it happens instantly and globally. A single strange memory can now spread across millions of minds within hours. This creates psychological conditions unlike anything previous generations experienced. Never before had human beings lived inside such a vast interconnected network of shared perception. And perhaps the Mandela effect represents one consequence of that transformation. A side effect of collective consciousness becoming digitally synchronized. There is another reason the phenomenon grew so rapidly online. The internet already feels unreal. Digital life exists in a strange space between truth and illusion. Photographs edited invisibly. Videos manipulated. Artificial intelligence generating human faces that never existed. Information changing constantly. Memory itself outsourced to search engines and cloud storage. Modern people increasingly rely on external systems to remember reality for them. And once memory becomes externalized, trust becomes fragile. The Mandela effect entered this environment perfectly, because it transforms abstract digital uncertainty into personal uncertainty. Now the instability is not merely online. It is inside memory itself, inside identity. Some researchers believe the internet intensified cognitive blending in ways humanity still does not fully understand. Millions of people consuming identical media repeatedly, sharing interpretations instantly, reinforcing alternate recollections collectively. The boundary between authentic memory and socially constructed memory becomes increasingly difficult to separate. Over time, repeated exposure can make alternate versions feel more real than original experiences. Yet even this explanation leaves behind unease, because many Mandela effect memories feel older than the internet itself. People insist they noticed discrepancies before online communities existed, before discussion forums, before social media, as though the internet did not create the phenomenon, but merely revealed it. And perhaps that possibility is even stranger. Because if the Mandela effect predates digital culture, then the internet may function less like a cause and more like a magnifying lens. A system exposing hidden instability already present within human consciousness. There is something almost ritualistic about how people encounter Mandela effects online. Usually late at night. Alone. Scrolling through old memories. One strange discrepancy appears. Then another. Then another. The experience becomes cumulative and hypnotic. A growing sensation that reality itself contains fractures hidden beneath ordinary life. Some people stop after mild curiosity. Others become consumed completely, searching endlessly for evidence. Old VHS recordings, vintage photographs, archived advertisements, proof that the remembered world once existed. Most never find definitive answers. Only more ambiguity, more contradictions, more uncertainty, and perhaps uncertainty itself is the true engine behind the Mandela effect. The human brain struggles to tolerate unresolved contradiction, especially contradiction involving memory and identity. The internet ensures those contradictions never disappear. Instead, they multiply continuously, fed by algorithms, discussion, speculation, and emotional reinforcement. This creates a strange feedback loop between technology and consciousness. The more people question reality online, the more unstable reality begins feeling psychologically. And the more unstable reality feels, the more persuasive Mandela effects become. Perhaps this is why the phenomenon feels uniquely modern. Not because memory suddenly changed, but because humanity entered an era where collective perception itself became fluid, editable, networked, unstable. Tonight, somewhere across the world, someone is discovering their first Mandela effect. A tiny detail remembered incorrectly. A logo, a film quote, a childhood memory. At first it feels harmless, almost amusing. Then they search online, and within moments, they discover millions of strangers remembering the exact same impossible thing. That is usually the moment the unease begins. The moment reality stops feeling completely solid. And once that feeling enters the mind, it rarely disappears completely again. Chapter 8. CERN and the Fear of Broken Reality. At some point, the Mandela effect stopped being only about memory. The conversations became darker, stranger, more cosmic. People no longer asked merely whether human beings remembered things incorrectly. They began asking something far more unsettling. What if reality itself had changed? And eventually, many of those questions led toward one place: CERN. Hidden beneath the border of Switzerland and France lies one of the most advanced scientific facilities ever built by humanity. A vast underground complex where particles travel near the speed of light inside enormous circular tunnels. The machine at the center of it all is known as the Large Hadron Collider, a structure so immense and technologically sophisticated that it already feels almost mythological to the average person. To scientists, CERN represents humanity's attempt to understand the deepest foundations of matter and reality. To the internet, however, it became something else entirely. A symbol, a doorway, a possible explanation for why reality suddenly feels wrong. The theories emerged gradually online. People noticed that many Mandela effect discussions intensified after CERN began operating the Large Hadron Collider in 2008. At first, the connection sounded absurd. How could particle physics alter human memory? But once the idea appeared, it spread rapidly. Because CERN already possessed the atmosphere of modern mythology. Massive underground machines, invisible forces, experiments involving the structure of reality itself. Even the scientific language surrounding the collider sounded almost unreal. Dark matter, quantum fields, dimensional theories, particle collisions recreating conditions from the birth of the universe. For many people, CERN did not feel like ordinary science. It felt like humanity interfering with forces barely understood. And perhaps that emotional atmosphere made the Mandela effect theories inevitable. Soon online communities began speculating that particle collisions had somehow fractured reality. Tiny timeline shifts, dimensional overlap, parallel universes bleeding together after high-energy experiments. Most scientists reject these theories entirely. There is no accepted evidence connecting CERN to memory anomalies or altered timelines. Yet the theories continue spreading because they resonate emotionally with something deeper. Modern civilization increasingly feels technologically incomprehensible. Most people do not truly understand the systems shaping reality around them. Artificial intelligence, quantum physics, genetic engineering, algorithms controlling information, invisible infrastructures operating beneath ordinary life. CERN became the perfect symbol for that hidden technological world, a place where reality itself appears negotiable. There is another reason the theories gain traction. The Mandela effect already creates the sensation that reality has shifted subtly, and particle physics already suggests the universe behaves in ways deeply counterintuitive to ordinary human perception. Quantum mechanics shattered classical assumptions about certainty long ago. Particles existing in probabilistic states, observation influencing outcomes, entanglement connecting distant objects mysteriously. To most people, these ideas already sound almost supernatural. The gap between advanced physics and science fiction became increasingly blurred within public imagination. And inside that blurred space, Mandela effect theories flourished, especially online. Some theorists pointed towards strange symbolism associated with CERN itself. Videos produced by employees containing surreal imagery, statues of Shiva standing outside the facility, unusual ceremonies captured on camera. Most of these examples have ordinary explanations: artistic expression, internet misinterpretation, corporate humor taken out of context. Yet together they created an atmosphere of unease difficult to ignore emotionally. CERN began feeling less like a laboratory and more like a modern mythological site, a place where humanity experiments with forces beyond complete understanding. And perhaps that symbolism matters more than factual evidence, because conspiracy theories rarely spread through logic alone. They spread through emotional resonance. The CERN theories resonate because they transform vague unease into narrative. A reason reality feels unstable. A reason memories no longer align perfectly. A reason the world itself seems subtly altered. There is something psychologically comforting about assigning uncertainty to a hidden cause, especially when modern life already feels fragmented and surreal. The digital age changed human perception dramatically within a single generation. Reality became mediated through screens. Information accelerated beyond biological limits. Artificial intelligence began imitating human creativity and speech. Deepfakes blurred truth further. The world increasingly resembles science fiction. And within such an environment, theories about fractured timelines no longer feel entirely impossible emotionally, especially late at night. Especially after encountering multiple Mandela effects personally. Some individuals describe the experience almost spiritually, a lingering sense that the world shifted around a certain point in time. That something fundamental changed after the early 2000s. Colors feel different. Culture feels stranger. Time itself seems accelerated. Psychologists explain these feelings through aging, nostalgia, cognitive bias, and media saturation. And perhaps they are correct. But emotionally, many people remain unconvinced, because the sensation feels deeper than nostalgia alone. It feels environmental, collective, as though humanity itself crossed an invisible threshold and never fully returned to normal afterward. CERN became attached to that feeling symbolically, not because evidence proved anything definitively, but because the organization represented humanity pushing against the edges of reality itself. And that idea carries ancient echoes. Throughout history, civilizations warned about forbidden knowledge, doors not meant to be opened, thresholds separating ordinary reality from chaos. The CERN theories tap into those archetypes powerfully. Modern science replacing ancient temples. Particle accelerators replacing ritual chambers. Physicists becoming the new priesthood exploring invisible dimensions beyond human comprehension. Whether people consciously believe these ideas almost becomes irrelevant. The symbolism alone exerts enormous psychological power, especially within a civilization increasingly uncertain about what reality even means anymore. Tonight, deep beneath Europe, the machines at CERN continue operating silently. Particles collide inside vast tunnels hidden beneath the Earth. Scientists search for answers about the origins of the universe. And across the internet, millions continue wondering whether something else may have happened there too. Something subtle. Something impossible to measure directly. A tiny fracture. A shift. A moment when reality itself perhaps became slightly misaligned. Not enough for the world to collapse. Only enough for people to notice that familiar things no longer feel entirely the same. And once that suspicion enters the human mind, ordinary reality never feels completely stable again. Chapter 9. The day reality started feeling different. Ask enough people about the Mandela effect, and eventually a strange pattern begins appearing. Many describe not only altered memories, but a feeling, a persistent sensation that the world itself changed at some point in time. Not dramatically, not in ways easy to prove, just subtly, like waking into a version of reality almost identical to the previous one, except for tiny differences impossible to fully explain. Some people place the shift around the early 2000s, others after 2012, some after personal trauma, illness, or emotional upheaval. The dates vary, but the emotional description remains remarkably similar. Reality feels thinner now, less stable, less authentic somehow. Time feels faster. People feel more disconnected. The atmosphere of the world itself seems altered. At first glance, these feelings sound psychological, and perhaps partly they are. Human perception changes with age. Technology reshapes attention. Stress alters memory and emotional processing. But the persistence of this sensation across millions of people is difficult to ignore entirely, especially because the feeling often arrives before individuals even discover the Mandela effect online, as though something already felt wrong, and the phenomenon simply gave language to it. This is where the Mandela effect becomes more than memory distortion. It becomes existential. Because the deeper people explore the phenomenon, the more they begin questioning not isolated details, but the nature of reality itself. There is a reason these discussions flourish late at night, in silence, in moments of exhaustion and introspection. Because the Mandela effect thrives in psychological liminal spaces, moments when ordinary certainty weakens slightly. And once certainty weakens, perception becomes vulnerable to deeper questions. Questions modern civilization increasingly struggles to answer. What is reality? How much of experience is constructed internally? Can memory ever truly be trusted? And perhaps most disturbing of all, how would human beings know if reality itself had changed? The idea sounds impossible initially, yet modern physics already describes a universe stranger than previous generations could have imagined. Quantum uncertainty, observer effects, probabilistic reality, simulation theory discussed openly by respected thinkers. The more science advances, the less solid reality sometimes appears philosophically. And inside that uncertainty, Mandela effect theories continue growing. not necessarily because evidence proves alternate timelines, but because modern people already sense instability everywhere around them. Digital life accelerated this feeling enormously. The internet compressed time psychologically. Years blur together. Information changes hourly. Trends rise and vanish overnight. Human attention fragments continuously across screens and algorithms. Many people now experience life as a constant stream of disconnected impressions rather than stable continuity. And perhaps this fragmentation creates conditions where reality itself begins feeling dreamlike, unanchored. Some theorists argue that the Mandela effect reflects collective psychological stress caused by rapid technological transformation. Human consciousness evolving too slowly for the digital age. Others believe something more literal may be occurring. Subtle shifts in timelines, overlapping realities, quantum fractures invisible except through memory residue. Official science rejects these theories. Yet emotionally, the ideas persist because they align with a deeper sensation millions already feel. That the world somehow lost solidity. That something intangible changed. Listen carefully to people discussing the Mandela effect long enough, and another recurring theme emerges. Nostalgia. Not ordinary nostalgia. Something heavier. Almost grief. Many describe the past as feeling warmer, more vivid, more emotionally real. Even the colors of childhood memories seem brighter somehow. Modern life, by comparison, feels artificial, flat, hyperreal, as though humanity crossed quietly from authentic reality into something simulated. Psychologists explain this through memory bias and emotional filtering. The brain softens the past over time. Childhood naturally feels emotionally heightened, and yet the emotional consistency across millions of people remains striking, especially when connected to the Mandela effect, because the phenomenon offers a narrative for that loss, a possibility that reality itself may genuinely be different now, not metaphorically, literally. There is also something uniquely modern about fearing altered reality. Previous civilizations feared monsters, curses, or divine punishment. Modern civilization fears simulation, manipulation, false memory, artificial reality. The anxieties evolved alongside technology itself. Today, people understand intellectually that perception can be manipulated. Photographs altered, voices synthesized, videos fabricated, entire online histories rewritten silently. Human beings now live inside systems capable of reshaping collective memory at unprecedented scale. And once society realizes reality can be edited technologically, the Mandela effect stops feeling absurd. It begins feeling eerily plausible. Even if only psychologically. Perhaps that is why the phenomenon continues spreading despite skepticism. Because it resonates with a civilization already uncertain about truth itself. Political narratives shift constantly. Media ecosystems contradict one another. Algorithms curate individual versions of reality. Two people can inhabit entirely different informational worlds while living side by side. Consensus reality weakens year after year. The Mandela effect may simply represent the emotional expression of that collapse. Or perhaps, something stranger truly is happening. That possibility remains difficult to dismiss completely once the feeling takes hold. The feeling that the world no longer matches memory perfectly. That reality itself contains tiny inconsistencies, tiny edits, tiny fractures hidden beneath ordinary life. And perhaps the most unsettling part is how impossible it becomes to prove either side conclusively. Memory is unreliable. yet the memories feel real. Reality appears stable, yet millions sense something different. The uncertainty remains unresolved, suspended between psychology and mystery. Tonight, somewhere in the darkness, someone is staring quietly at an old photograph, a childhood cartoon, or a familiar logo with the same strange feeling. The feeling that the world they remember may no longer fully exist. And perhaps that is the true horror hidden beneath the Mandela effect. Not that memories are false, but that reality itself may be far more fragile than human beings were ever meant to realize. Chapter 10. The False Memories Experiment. In the 1990s, psychologists began conducting experiments that would deeply unsettle anyone interested in memory. Not because the experiments were violent, but because they revealed how easily the human mind could be convinced that something imaginary had actually happened. Researchers discovered that entirely false memories could sometimes be implanted into ordinary people through suggestion alone. Childhood events that never occurred, places never visited, moments completely invented. And over time, many participants began describing these false memories with emotional confidence. Some even added details spontaneously. Sounds, weather, conversations. The memories grew naturally inside the mind as though they had always existed. One of the most famous examples became known as the Lost in the Mall experiment. Participants were told stories about childhood experiences supposedly provided by family members. Most were real. One was fake. The false story described the participant becoming lost in a shopping mall as a child before eventually being rescued. At first, many subjects rejected the memory completely. But gradually, something strange happened. A significant number began accepting the event as real. Some even described visual details and emotions connected to an experience that had never occurred. To psychologists, the experiments demonstrated the reconstructive nature of memory. The brain does not store perfect recordings. It builds narratives, and narratives can be altered. Yet for many people studying the Mandela effect, these experiments raised an even darker possibility. If false memories can be created intentionally, how often might they form naturally? And how would anyone know the difference? This question becomes especially unsettling when applied to collective memory, because the Mandela effect involves not isolated individuals, but massive groups of people sharing identical alternate recollections. Official psychology explains this through social reinforcement and cognitive bias. One person introduces an incorrect memory. Others unconsciously adopt it. Eventually, the memory spreads socially until it feels real. Scientifically, the mechanism makes sense. But emotionally, something still feels incomplete to many observers. Because some Mandela effect memories appear unusually vivid, emotionally anchored, as though they connect to something deeper than suggestion alone. There is another disturbing detail within false memory research. People rarely realize when their memories have changed. The altered memory simply feels authentic. That may be the most frightening part of all. Human beings trust memory instinctively. Without memory, identity itself becomes unstable. Yet experiments repeatedly demonstrate that memory is flexible, editable, vulnerable. Even emotionally powerful memories may contain major distortions without the person ever noticing. This creates a deeply uncomfortable possibility. Most people assume their internal history belongs to them completely. But what if memory is constantly being rewritten beneath conscious awareness? Not maliciously, not deliberately, simply through the brain's endless attempt to create coherent narrative from incomplete information. The Mandela effect exists precisely within that uncertainty. between memory and reconstruction, between reality and interpretation. And once someone understands how fragile memory truly is, ordinary life begins feeling slightly different, less certain, less solid. Researchers discovered that emotion plays a major role in false memory formation. The stronger the emotional connection, the more convincing the memory becomes. This may explain why so many Mandela effect examples involve childhood, famous events, beloved movies, or cultural symbols. Emotion anchors memory deeply. But emotion can also distort memory profoundly. The mind prioritizes meaning over accuracy, narrative over detail. And perhaps that is why entire groups can remember the same impossible thing. Not because reality changed necessarily, but because human beings build reality socially through shared narrative structures. Still, there are moments when the scientific explanations begin feeling strangely thin, especially late at night, especially after encountering multiple Mandela effects personally. The rational mind understands the psychology, yet the feeling remains. That subtle sensation that some memories are too vivid to dismiss completely, too emotionally real. Some researchers quietly admit that memory science still contains enormous mysteries. Consciousness itself remains poorly understood. No one fully knows how subjective experience becomes stored inside the brain, or why certain memories feel permanently authentic while others dissolve quickly. The Mandela effect thrives inside those unanswered questions, because uncertainty creates space for possibility. And perhaps that is why the phenomenon continues spreading. Not because people reject science, but because science itself increasingly reveals how strange the human mind truly is. Tonight, somewhere in the world, someone is remembering an event that never happened, or perhaps remembering it differently than reality records it. And they will never fully know whether the memory is false, because inside the mind, false memories rarely feel false. They simply feel real. Chapter 11. People who remember too much. Most people fear forgetting. Forgetting names, faces, moments from childhood, entire years slowly dissolving into fragments. Memory fades naturally with time, and humanity has accepted this for centuries as part of life itself. But there are rare individuals who experience the opposite condition. People who remember almost everything. And strangely, their existence may reveal something deeply unsettling about memory itself. A small number of individuals possess what researchers call highly superior autobiographical memory, the ability to recall enormous portions of their lives in extraordinary detail. Dates, conversations, weather, ordinary moments most minds would lose forever. Ask them about a random day from years earlier, and they can often describe it instantly. Not approximately. Precisely. At first, this sounds almost supernatural. A perfect memory. A gift. But many who live with the condition describe it differently. Exhausting. Overwhelming. Sometimes unbearable, because forgetting serves an important psychological purpose. Without forgetting, the mind becomes crowded with endless detail. Painful experiences remain vivid for years. Embarrassment never fades completely. Old grief remains emotionally accessible as though it happened yesterday. Memory becomes less like a library and more like a prison. Researchers studying these individuals discovered something unexpected. Even extremely powerful memory is not perfectly accurate. People capable of recalling astonishing detail can still experience distortions, false associations, and reconstructed narratives. In other words, certainty does not guarantee truth. This realization deeply complicates the Mandela effect. Because many people experiencing Mandela effects describe their memories with extraordinary confidence. And confidence alone turns out to mean very little scientifically. The brain can feel absolutely certain while still being wrong. Yet this explanation creates another unsettling question. If even powerful memory systems remain vulnerable to distortion, what does genuine reality look like inside the human mind? Perhaps no one experiences objective reality directly at all. Only interpretations, reconstructions, narratives constantly updated beneath conscious awareness. The people who remember too much reveal something disturbing about human consciousness. Memory is not fixed storage. It is living architecture, changing continuously over time. And sometimes those changes happen without awareness. Some Mandela effect researchers became fascinated by individuals with unusually strong memory because they hoped such people might settle certain debates definitively. But the results often created more ambiguity instead. Even highly detailed rememberers occasionally reported Mandela effects themselves, experiencing the same strange certainty as everyone else. The same unsettling feeling that reality no longer matched memory exactly. This matters because it weakens the assumption that the Mandela effect belongs only to careless or inattentive minds. Sometimes the people most confident in their memory experience it too. And perhaps that is why the phenomenon continues feeling psychologically unresolved. There is another strange pattern surrounding memory. Human beings rarely remember isolated facts. They remember emotional meaning, atmosphere, narrative structure. The brain stores experiences almost like stories rather than recordings. This is why childhood memories often feel dreamlike, and why Mandela effects carry emotional weight beyond the actual discrepancies themselves. The altered detail becomes symbolic, a crack in certainty, proof that memory may not belong entirely to conscious control. Some theorists believe this is why the phenomenon feels almost spiritual to certain people. Not because logos or movie quotes truly matter, but because the Mandela effect exposes how fragile identity really is. After all, identity depends upon remembered continuity, the feeling that the past connects reliably to the present. But if memory shifts quietly over time, then the self shifts too. And perhaps human beings sense this instability unconsciously, especially in the modern world. Digital technology changed humanity's relationship with memory dramatically. People no longer remember information the way previous generations did. Search engines remember instead. Cloud storage remembers instead. Photographs document moments instantly, often replacing direct experience itself. Modern humans increasingly outsource memory to machines, and perhaps this weakens trust in internal memory even further. The Mandela effect flourishes inside that uncertainty, a world where memory already feels externalized and unstable. Some neuroscientists believe memory evolved less for accuracy and more for survival. The brain preserves what feels useful emotionally, socially, and biologically. Absolute precision may never have been the goal. Coherence was a workable narrative. And if that is true, then every human being may already exist inside a partially fictionalized version of reality constructed by the mind. The Mandela effect simply reveals the seams, the moments when reconstruction becomes visible. Perhaps that is why people react so emotionally when encountering strong Mandela effects. Not because the discrepancies themselves are large, but because the experience briefly exposes the machinery behind consciousness. The realization that memory is fluid, editable, unstable. Tonight, somewhere in the darkness, someone is remembering their past with perfect emotional certainty. A childhood room, a familiar logo, a famous line from an old film. And somewhere else, another person remembers the same thing differently with equal certainty. Both memories feel real. Both feel authentic. Yet reality allows only one version to exist officially. Or perhaps, memory was never designed to preserve reality perfectly in the first place. Chapter 12. The Psychology of Collective Recall. One person remembering something incorrectly is ordinary. Millions remembering the same impossible detail is something else entirely. This is the question at the center of the Mandela effect. Not memory alone, but collective memory. Because the phenomenon becomes truly unsettling only when large groups begin sharing identical alternate recollections. The same movie quote, the same logo, the same historical event remembered differently across thousands of strangers. And somehow, the emotional certainty often feels synchronized too. Psychologists refer to this process as collective recall, the way groups unconsciously shape memory together over time. Human beings are deeply social creatures. People rarely build memory in isolation. Conversations influence recollection constantly. Families repeat stories until details solidify. Cultures simplify narratives into emotionally satisfying forms. Over time, repeated retelling changes memory itself. Not deliberately, naturally. This happens everywhere. Historical events become mythologized. Conversations become cleaner in hindsight. Complex moments transform into simple narratives easier for the brain to store. And once enough people repeat the same version, the altered memory begins feeling unquestionably real. The Mandela effect may represent this process operating at massive scale through the internet. Yet even this explanation leaves behind a strange emotional residue. Because many people experiencing Mandela effects insist they encountered the discrepancies before discussing them with anyone else. The memories feel independent, personal, not socially implanted. This creates an uncomfortable tension between psychology and subjective experience. The science explains the mechanism, but the emotional certainty remains difficult to dissolve completely. There is another reason collective memory becomes unstable. Human beings unconsciously prioritize meaning over precision. The brain wants patterns, narrative consistency, emotional coherence. This is why alternate Mandela effect memories often feel more natural than official reality. Luke, I am your father sounds more complete than the actual line. The Monopoly man feels correct with a monocle because the image matches cultural expectation. The mind reshapes memory towards symbolic familiarity. And when millions of people share similar cultural patterns, millions may drift toward identical alternate recollections. Still, there is something almost eerie about how synchronized those recollections become, especially online. The internet transformed collective memory into something humanity had never experienced before. A single idea can now spread globally within hours. Repeated exposure strengthens emotional certainty rapidly. Communities form around shared recollections. And once collective reinforcement begins, alternate memories grow increasingly difficult to separate from lived experience. Some researchers believe the Mandela effect reveals how fragile consensus reality truly is. Society depends heavily on shared agreement about the past. History itself functions partly through collective memory. But collective memory is surprisingly vulnerable. Political narratives shift. Media reframes events. Cultures reinterpret the past continuously. Over time, entire societies can begin remembering history differently. The Mandela effect may simply expose that process in unusually visible ways. There is also a darker possibility hidden beneath collective recall. Human beings often fear isolation more than inaccuracy. People unconsciously adapt memories to align socially with groups around them. Belonging matters psychologically. Consensus feels safe. This may explain why some Mandela effects spread explosively online once communities form around them. Agreement strengthens certainty, and certainty strengthens emotional attachment. Eventually, the alternate memory feels not only true, but socially reinforced. Yet something about the Mandela effect still resists complete psychological reduction, because the phenomenon carries atmosphere, a strange emotional texture difficult to describe scientifically. Not merely confusion, displacement, a feeling that reality itself has drifted slightly sideways. Perhaps this feeling emerges because the Mandela effect attacks one of humanity's deepest assumptions: that memory creates stable continuity between past and present. Without trusted memory, identity weakens. And without collective memory, culture weakens too. The phenomenon quietly destabilizes both. This may explain why Mandela effect discussions often become philosophical very quickly. People begin with movie quotes and logos, then arrive at questions about consciousness itself. What is memory? What is reality? How much of personal identity is constructed socially? And how much of the world do human beings truly perceive directly? Modern neuroscience increasingly suggests perception itself is collaborative. The brain constantly predicts reality using social and environmental cues. In many ways, humans experience not raw reality, but negotiated reality, a shared simulation stabilized collectively through language, memory, and agreement. The Mandela effect exposes cracks in that negotiation, moments when collective certainty begins splitting into competing versions. And perhaps that is why the experience feels so psychologically powerful. Because once someone realizes large groups can remember impossible things with complete sincerity, reality itself begins feeling less fixed than before. Tonight, somewhere online, thousands of strangers are discussing memories that officially never existed. And despite all scientific explanations, many of them still share the same unsettling feeling, that they are not simply remembering incorrectly, but remembering something the world itself no longer contains, a fragment from another version of reality, still lingering quietly inside the human mind. Chapter 13: Dreams, Déjà Vu, and Reality Glitches. Long before the Mandela effect had a name, human beings already experienced moments when reality felt unstable. A sudden feeling that a moment had happened before, a place seeming strangely familiar despite never being visited. A dream later appearing to unfold in waking life with unsettling accuracy. These experiences exist in nearly every culture throughout history. And perhaps that is because they touch something ancient inside human consciousness. Something difficult to explain completely. One of the strangest of these phenomena is déjà vu. That brief, disorienting sensation that the present moment has already occurred somehow. Most people experience it at least once, usually unexpectedly. A conversation, a hallway, a random afternoon, and suddenly reality feels duplicated, like memory arriving before experience itself. Scientists generally explain déjà vu as a timing irregularity within the brain, a brief mismatch in how information is processed and categorized into memory. Essentially, the brain accidentally labels the present as familiar. The explanation sounds reasonable, yet the emotional sensation remains deeply strange. Because during genuine déjà vu, the familiarity often feels overwhelming. Not imagined, not symbolic, real. The Mandela effect operates within similar psychological territory. Both phenomena create a temporary fracture in certainty, a feeling that reality and memory are no longer perfectly aligned. And for many people, the emotional atmosphere surrounding these experiences feels almost identical. Dreamlike, dislocated, unsettling. There are also countless stories of people dreaming events before they happen. Not vague symbolic dreams. Specific moments later appearing in waking life with disturbing similarity. A sentence, a room, a stranger's face. Psychologists argue that coincidence and selective memory explain most such experiences. Human beings forget the thousands of dreams that never come true and focus intensely on the few that resemble reality afterward. Scientifically, this explanation makes sense. But emotionally, precognitive dreams continue haunting human culture for a reason. Because when such moments happen personally, they feel impossible to dismiss completely. The Mandela effect often triggers the same emotional reaction. A feeling that ordinary explanations fail to capture the full experience, especially when multiple strange perceptions begin accumulating together. Déjà vu, false memories, reality glitches, recurring dreams. The modern internet gave these experiences a new language. Glitches in the Matrix. A phrase inspired partly by the Matrix, where repeated visual anomalies signal instability inside simulated reality. At first the term sounded humorous, but over time, millions began using it sincerely. People described strange moments where reality appeared briefly inconsistent, objects disappearing and reappearing, conversations remembered differently by different individuals, places feeling subtly altered overnight. Most stories remain anecdotal, unprovable, yet collectively, they reveal something psychologically important. Modern people increasingly feel disconnected from stable reality, and perhaps that feeling existed long before the internet. Technology simply amplified it. There is another unsettling aspect to dreams and memory. The brain processes both through overlapping systems. Dreams can influence waking memory. Waking experiences can alter dream content retroactively. Sometimes the boundary between remembered dreams and remembered reality becomes surprisingly fragile, especially over long periods of time. Some researchers believe certain Mandela effects may emerge partly from this blending process. Imagine scenarios merging unconsciously with authentic memory until the distinction disappears completely. Yet once again, the emotional certainty involved remains difficult to explain away entirely, because many people describe Mandela effects not like imagination, but recognition, as though remembering something forgotten rather than invented. This distinction matters psychologically. Recognition feels external, discovered, not created. Perhaps that is why theories involving alternate timelines and parallel realities became so emotionally persuasive online. They align naturally with the feeling people describe. Not "I imagined it," but "I remember another version." And perhaps the human mind is especially vulnerable to such ideas because consciousness itself already feels mysterious. No one fully understands why subjective awareness exists, or why reality feels coherent at all. Modern neuroscience explains mechanisms, but not experience itself. And inside that uncertainty, strange possibilities survive. There is something profoundly unsettling about realizing how much of ordinary reality depends upon interpretation. The brain filters enormous amounts of information constantly, constructing a stable world from incomplete sensory data. Most of the time, this process feels invisible. But experiences like déjà vu and the Mandela effect briefly expose the seams. the moments when the machinery becomes visible, when reality stops feeling automatic. Some people dismiss these moments immediately. Others become fascinated by them for years. Because once someone experiences reality feeling unstable personally, even briefly, ordinary certainty becomes difficult to restore completely. The world still functions normally, but something changes psychologically. A small doubt enters perception. A quiet suspicion that consciousness may not fully understand the reality it inhabits. Tonight, somewhere in the darkness, someone is experiencing déjà vu for the first time. A strange moment repeating itself impossibly. And elsewhere, another person is staring at an old memory that no longer matches reality. Both experiences carry the same unsettling feeling. That reality may not be as fixed as it appears. Or perhaps, that the human mind occasionally catches glimpses of something hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life. Chapter 14. The Quantum Theory of Parallel Worlds. For most of human history, reality appeared simple. One world, one timeline, one continuous flow of events moving from past to future. But modern physics quietly complicated that certainty. And once people began connecting quantum theory to the Mandela effect, the mystery became far stranger than memory alone. One interpretation of quantum mechanics suggests a startling possibility: that reality may not consist of a single universe at all, but countless parallel versions existing simultaneously. This idea became known as the many worlds interpretation. According to the theory, every quantum possibility creates branching realities. Every outcome exists somewhere. Different versions of events unfolding across endless parallel worlds. To physicists, the interpretation remains controversial but mathematically serious. To the Internet, however, it became something much larger. A possible explanation for the Mandela effect itself. The theory spread quickly online because it seemed to answer the emotional core of the phenomenon perfectly. What if people are not remembering incorrectly? What if they remember fragments from neighboring timelines? Tiny traces from realities once connected to their own. At first glance, the idea sounds purely like science fiction. Yet quantum physics already behaves in ways profoundly counterintuitive to ordinary human experience. Particles exist in probabilistic states until measured. Quantum entanglement connects objects across enormous distances mysteriously. Observation itself appears strangely important within certain interpretations of physics. The deeper scientists study reality, the stranger reality becomes. And inside that strangeness, parallel world theories found fertile ground, especially among people already unsettled by Mandela effects personally, because the theory explains not only incorrect memory, but synchronized incorrect memory. Millions recalling the same alternate details because, according to the idea, those details may once have existed in another branch of reality. Most scientists reject using quantum theory this way. There is no accepted evidence that human consciousness moves between parallel timelines or retains memories from alternate universes. Yet emotionally, the theory remains compelling, because it transforms confusion into narrative. A reason the world feels subtly wrong. A reason familiar details no longer match memory exactly. And perhaps modern civilization was already psychologically prepared for such ideas. Movies, video games, and digital culture normalized multiverse concepts long before the Mandela effect became widespread. Entire generations grew up consuming stories about branching timelines and alternate realities. By the time Mandela effect discussions emerged online, the cultural language already existed. The theories fit naturally into modern imagination. There is another reason parallel world explanations resonate so strongly. The Mandela effect rarely involves major changes. History remains mostly intact. The world stays recognizable. Only small details shift. A logo, a line from a film, the spelling of a childhood book. This subtlety strangely matches the emotional logic of overlapping realities, as though neighboring timelines differ only slightly from one another, close enough to create confusion, different enough to create unease. Some theorists even propose that certain historical moments may have caused massive timeline divergence, technological breakthroughs, global catastrophes, scientific experiments. Others believe consciousness itself may move between realities continuously without awareness. Most of these ideas remain speculative and unsupported scientifically. Yet they persist because they align emotionally with how the Mandela effect feels. Not random, displaced. There is something psychologically seductive about the multiverse concept. It offers escape from finality. Every choice existing somewhere, every possibility surviving in another reality. But it also carries quiet horror, because if infinite versions of reality exist, then certainty disappears completely. No single timeline remains uniquely stable. The Mandela effect amplifies that fear dramatically, because it suggests human beings may occasionally notice the boundaries between realities. Tiny inconsistencies leaking through. Fragments from worlds almost identical to this one. Modern physics itself unintentionally contributes to this atmosphere. The language of quantum mechanics already sounds dreamlike to non-scientists. Probability waves, superposition, non-locality, reality behaving differently when observed. Even experts admit that quantum theory resists intuitive understanding. And when science itself becomes mysterious, speculative interpretations spread easily, especially online, especially late at night. Some researchers argue that the Mandela effect reveals less about physics and more about human psychology. The brain struggles with uncertainty and seeks patterns instinctively. Parallel timelines provide emotionally satisfying structure for otherwise unsettling experiences. And perhaps that explanation is correct. Yet even understanding the psychology does not entirely dissolve the feeling, because the Mandela effect rarely persuades through evidence alone. It persuades through atmosphere, a strange sense that reality itself may contain hidden depth beyond ordinary perception. The parallel world theory gives shape to that sensation, a narrative for why the world feels almost, but not entirely, familiar. Tonight, somewhere in the darkness, someone is staring at a detail they swear used to be different. A word, a symbol, a memory, and perhaps they will dismiss the feeling immediately. Or perhaps they will begin wondering something far stranger, whether somewhere, impossibly close to this reality, another version of the world still exists quietly beside our own. A world where the memory was correct all along. Chapter 15. The Simulation Hypothesis. At some point, the Mandela effect stopped feeling like a memory problem entirely. For many people, it became evidence of something far more disturbing. The possibility that reality itself may not be real in the way humanity has always assumed. This idea is known as the simulation hypothesis. The theory proposes that the universe may be an artificial construct, a simulated environment generated by intelligence far beyond human understanding. Not metaphorically, literally. A manufactured reality indistinguishable from the authentic one inside it. For centuries, such an idea would have sounded absurd. Today, it feels strangely plausible to many people. Perhaps because modern technology already imitates reality increasingly well. Video games create immersive worlds. Artificial intelligence generates human speech and faces convincingly. Virtual reality blurs sensory boundaries more every year. Human civilization itself is slowly learning how to manufacture believable realities. And once that process begins, an uncomfortable question naturally follows. If humans can eventually simulate consciousness, what prevents a more advanced civilization from already doing so? Philosophers and scientists have discussed this possibility seriously for years. Some argue statistically it may even be likely, because simulated realities could theoretically outnumber original ones enormously. If advanced civilizations create countless simulations, then conscious beings inside those simulations might vastly exceed biological civilizations in number. Meaning statistically, humanity may be more likely to exist inside a simulation than outside one. The idea sounds impossible, yet once considered carefully, it becomes difficult to dismiss entirely, especially within the atmosphere of the Mandela effect, because the phenomenon resembles something strangely familiar to modern digital culture. A glitch, tiny inconsistencies, small errors appearing inside an otherwise stable system. This is precisely why the simulation hypothesis became deeply connected to Mandela effect discussions online. Altered logos, changed movie quotes, historical inconsistencies, all interpreted by some people as evidence of reality being edited silently. Updated, patched. Theories emerged suggesting Mandela effects are leftover traces from modifications within the simulation itself. Small changes not perfectly synchronized across consciousness. Residual memory surviving after updates. Official science rejects these ideas completely. There is no evidence proving reality functions like a computer simulation. Yet emotionally, the theory resonates powerfully with modern experience. Because life increasingly feels digital already. Human interaction filtered through screens. Identity existing partly online. Algorithms shaping thought, emotion, and memory invisibly. Modern people spend enormous portions of life inside artificial systems. The distinction between physical and virtual reality weakens constantly. And perhaps this cultural transformation prepared humanity psychologically for simulation theories long before the Mandela effect appeared. There is another unsettling aspect to the simulation hypothesis. If reality is artificial, then certainty itself becomes unstable. Physical laws could theoretically change. Memories could be altered. Entire histories rewritten silently. Within a simulation, continuity depends entirely on the system maintaining it. And the Mandela effect feels eerily compatible with that fear. Tiny edits occurring beneath awareness. Reality remaining mostly functional while small details shift unexpectedly. Some theorists compare Mandela effects to corrupted files or synchronization errors. Not catastrophic failures. Only subtle inconsistencies exposing the artificial structure underneath. Again, there is no scientific evidence for this interpretation. Yet the emotional logic feels strangely persuasive to many people. Especially because modern life already resembles simulation aesthetically. Cities illuminated by screens. Digital avatars replacing physical presence. Artificial intelligence imitating human creativity. The world increasingly feels constructed rather than organic. Even time itself feels accelerated technologically. Years blur together. Reality changes faster than human psychology comfortably adapts. Perhaps that instability makes simulation theories emotionally attractive. They transform vague unease into narrative. A reason the world feels increasingly unreal. Some philosophers argue the simulation hypothesis simply updates ancient spiritual ideas into technological language. Previous civilizations imagined existence as illusion, dream, or divine projection. Modern civilization imagines code, algorithms, artificial systems. The archetype remains similar, only the symbols changed. And perhaps that explains why simulation theories resonate so deeply psychologically. They touch an ancient human suspicion that ordinary reality may conceal something larger beyond perception. The Mandela effect intensifies that suspicion dramatically, because it introduces the possibility that reality contains visible imperfections, tiny moments where the illusion weakens slightly. The internet amplified these fears enormously. Online communities collect glitches in reality endlessly. Stories of impossible coincidences, disappearing objects, time distortions, contradictory memories. Most examples remain anecdotal and explainable individually, but together they create atmosphere, a growing cultural sense that reality itself feels unstable, artificial somehow. And perhaps this feeling reflects more than conspiracy theories alone. Modern civilization increasingly experiences life through mediation rather than direct experience. Reality filtered through algorithms, media systems, and digital interpretation. Human beings already inhabit partially constructed realities psychologically. The simulation hypothesis simply pushes that realization to its extreme conclusion. Tonight, somewhere in the darkness, someone is staring at an old memory that no longer matches reality. And perhaps they will explain it scientifically, perhaps psychologically, or perhaps they will wonder something much stranger. Whether the world itself may not be entirely natural, whether somewhere behind ordinary existence, hidden beyond perception, an invisible system quietly continues running, adjusting, updating, maintaining the illusion of reality one moment at a time. Chapter 16. Why so many people feel disconnected from reality. There is a feeling many people struggle to describe clearly. Not sadness, not anxiety, something quieter, more abstract. A sense that the world is not fully real in the way it used to be. Or perhaps that the individual observing it is not fully inside it anymore. Psychologists sometimes refer to related experiences as derealization or depersonalization. But the modern version feels broader than clinical definitions. It appears across millions of people in subtle forms. A strange emotional distance from everyday life. A sense that reality is slightly muted, less vivid than before. Many describe it in similar language. Everything feels like a simulation. Nothing feels fully solid anymore. Time is moving too fast. I feel detached from my own memories. These sensations have existed throughout history, but they appear more frequently in modern discussions than ever before. And they often overlap with interest in phenomena like the Mandela effect, because both touch the same underlying feeling, that reality is not entirely stable. One explanation points towards psychological overload. Modern life exposes human attention to unprecedented levels of information, constant notifications, endless media streams, rapid context switching. The brain evolved for slow, grounded environments, not continuous digital acceleration. As a result, perception may begin fragmenting under cognitive pressure. Moments stop feeling fully processed. Memory becomes less anchored. Experience feels less continuous. Another explanation focuses on emotional fatigue. Many people today experience prolonged stress without sufficient recovery. Work pressure, financial uncertainty, social comparison through digital platforms, global instability visible at every moment through news cycles. Over time, emotional saturation can flatten perception. The world feels less real not because reality changed, but because emotional responsiveness becomes dulled. Yet neither explanation fully captures the intensity some people report, because the feeling is not just fatigue or distraction. It is often described as existential distance, as though life is happening slightly behind glass, or as if consciousness is observing reality rather than inhabiting it fully. This sensation becomes especially strong in quiet environments, late at night, during isolation, in moments when external stimulation decreases and internal awareness increases. And interestingly, many Mandela effect experiences are also reported in similar conditions. Silence, fatigue, late-night reflection. The mind becomes more sensitive to subtle inconsistencies. Memory feels less anchored. Reality feels more flexible. There is also a cultural dimension to this phenomenon. Modern society increasingly separates individuals from direct physical experience. Work happens on screens. Relationships exist partially online. Even entertainment is consumed passively rather than participated in actively. As a result, the boundary between lived reality and mediated reality becomes less clear. People spend significant portions of life inside representations of reality rather than reality itself. And representations are always slightly detached. They lack texture, weight, continuity. Over time, this can create a subtle psychological effect, the feeling that life is being observed rather than lived. There is another important factor: speed. Everything moves faster now. Information updates constantly. Trends rise and disappear within days. Cultural memory changes rapidly. This acceleration disrupts the mind's natural ability to form stable internal narratives. And without stable narratives, reality begins feeling fragmented. Not broken, just less coherent. The Mandela effect fits into this landscape naturally. It represents moments when internal narrative conflicts with external information. Memory says one thing, recorded reality says another, and the mismatch produces emotional friction. That friction is often interpreted not as simple error, but as something deeper, a sign that reality itself may be unstable. There is also a philosophical layer to this experience. Human consciousness never directly accesses reality. It always processes interpretation, signals from senses reconstructed into internal models. This means every person lives inside a mental version of the world, not the world itself. Usually this distinction remains invisible, but phenomena like the Mandela effect briefly expose it. They reveal the gap between perception and external record. And once that gap becomes noticeable, even slightly, it can be difficult to ignore again. Some researchers argue that modern digital life increases this gap, because so much of what people experience is already mediated, filtered, reconstructed. Even memory itself is now externalized through photos, videos, and digital archives. This weakens the sense of internal continuity. The mind no longer feels like the sole repository of experience. Instead, memory is distributed across systems, and distributed memory feels less personal, less anchored. Perhaps that contributes to the growing sense of detachment many people report. Not a loss of reality, but a loss of certainty about how reality is being experienced. The Mandela effect intensifies this uncertainty by introducing contradictions between internal memory and external record. And those contradictions are difficult for the mind to resolve cleanly, because both sides feel valid. Memory feels real. Documentation feels real. Yet they do not match. So the mind searches for explanations. Psychological, cultural, technological, sometimes even cosmological. Anything that can restore coherence. But often the feeling remains unresolved. A quiet tension between what is remembered and what is recorded. Between lived experience and documented history. And perhaps that tension is the core of the entire phenomenon. Not alternate timelines. Not hidden forces. But the instability that appears whenever human memory meets an externalized world that no longer fully aligns with it. Tonight, somewhere in the world, someone is quietly looking at something familiar and feeling, for a brief moment, that it is not quite the same as it once was. And they may not have words for that feeling yet. Only the sense that reality itself has become slightly less certain than before. Chapter 17. The fear that history can change. Most people assume history is fixed. What happened, happened. It cannot be altered. Only misremembered. Only misinterpreted. Only forgotten. But the Mandela effect introduces a different kind of unease. Not the fear of forgetting history, but the fear that history itself may not be as stable as it appears. Because the phenomenon does not feel like simple memory loss. It feels like mismatch between what is remembered and what is recorded, between internal certainty and external evidence. And that mismatch creates a very specific psychological tension. If memory can be wrong, then personal history becomes unreliable. But if many people share the same wrong memory, then something more complicated seems to be happening. This is where anxiety begins to deepen. Not into panic, but into doubt. A quiet questioning of how fixed reality actually is. Historically, humanity has always experienced shifts in collective memory. Ancient events are retold differently across cultures. Myths reshape historical figures. Political narratives change depending on perspective. Even recent history can be reframed within decades. So in a broad sense, history is already fluid in interpretation. But the Mandela effect feels different because it operates at a more intimate level. It does not concern major historical events alone. It concerns details people believed were never in question. A logo, a line, a spelling, a small visual structure embedded deeply in everyday life. And when those small anchors feel altered, the emotional response is disproportionately strong. Because identity is not built only on major events. It is built on countless tiny certainties accumulated over time. The Mandela effect quietly destabilizes those certainties. There is also a deeper fear hidden beneath the surface. If collective memory can be wrong, then who or what determines what is officially real? Recorded history is not self-verifying. It depends on documentation. And documentation depends on preservation. And preservation depends on systems that can fail, be edited, or be lost. In digital environments especially, records can change without leaving obvious traces for most people. Web pages update. Archives are rewritten. Media versions are replaced. Even photographs and videos can be edited in ways that become indistinguishable from originals. This does not mean reality is unstable, but it does mean access to reality is increasingly mediated. And mediated reality always introduces uncertainty. The Mandela effect sits directly inside that uncertainty. It highlights the gap between lived memory and recorded information. And that gap can feel like a fracture, not in reality itself, but in confidence about reality. There is another reason the phenomenon feels emotionally powerful. Human beings rely on shared history to maintain social stability. Societies function through agreement about what happened in the past. Shared narratives, shared facts, shared cultural memory. When those shared anchors feel unreliable, even slightly, the sense of collective stability weakens. The Mandela effect touches that system at a very sensitive point. Not rewriting major history, but introducing doubt into the smallest shared certainties. And small doubts accumulate. There is also a psychological mechanism at work. When people encounter contradictions between memory and record, the mind attempts to resolve the conflict. If resolution is not possible, uncertainty remains. And uncertainty is uncomfortable for the human brain. So it searches for patterns, explanations, narratives that restore coherence. Some turn to psychology, some to cultural theory, some to physics, some to more speculative ideas. But regardless of interpretation, the underlying emotional state remains similar, a sense that something does not fully align. Interestingly, this sensation does not require belief in conspiracy theories to exist. Even skeptical individuals can experience it, because it originates in perception, not ideology. The Mandela effect is not primarily about what people believe. It is about what people feel when belief and evidence do not align. There is also a temporal aspect to this fear. Modern life moves quickly. Historical context is constantly updated in real time. Events are recorded instantly and then reshaped through commentary, editing, and reinterpretation. This creates a strange condition where history feels less like a fixed record, and more like an ongoing construction. And if history feels under construction, then certainty about the past naturally weakens. The Mandela effect amplifies this perception by introducing micro-contradictions into familiar memories. It is not that the entire past feels unstable, only specific points. But those points are emotionally significant enough to create disproportionate impact. A childhood memory, a famous film, a widely recognized symbol. And because these are shared across millions of people, the effect feels collective, almost cultural. Some researchers suggest that the Mandela effect reflects a transition in how humanity relates to information. From stable, localized memory systems to dynamic, continuously updating information environments. In such environments, the boundary between remembered history and recorded history becomes less distinct. And when boundaries blur, confidence declines. Not necessarily belief, but confidence. And that distinction is important, because the Mandela effect does not usually destroy belief in reality. It destabilizes certainty about it. That subtle difference is what gives the phenomenon its psychological weight. Tonight, somewhere in the world, someone is revisiting an old photograph, a childhood memory, or a familiar piece of history. And for a brief moment, they feel a quiet tension they cannot easily explain. Not fear exactly, not confusion exactly, but a soft, persistent doubt, as though the past is no longer as fixed as it once seemed. Chapter 18. The Quiet Horror of Unstable Reality. In the end, the Mandela effect does not arrive like a revelation. It arrives quietly, through small details. A word that looks slightly wrong, a memory that feels too certain to doubt, a familiar image that no longer matches what is seen. At first, it is almost harmless. A curiosity, a strange coincidence, something to mention once and forget. But for some people, it does not stay small. It accumulates. One inconsistency becomes two, two become 10. And gradually, the sense of stability begins to shift. not dramatically, subtly, like the floor of reality becoming less firm underfoot. There is a reason the phenomenon persists across so many cultures and communities. It does not depend on belief systems. It does not require education or background knowledge. It appears wherever human memory meets recorded information. And that intersection has become unavoidable in the modern world. Because today, almost everything is recorded, and almost everything is compared. This constant comparison creates friction between memory and external record. And that friction is where the Mandela effect lives psychologically. Not as proof of alternate worlds, not as evidence of simulation or fracture, but as a lived experience of contradiction between two systems of truth, internal and external, private and collective. There is something quietly unsettling about realizing how dependent human certainty is on external confirmation. People feel sure of their memories until they are told otherwise. And when enough people disagree with a memory, even confidence begins to weaken. This is not because memory disappears, but because certainty is social. The Mandela effect exposes this dependency in an unusually visible way. There is also a deeper emotional layer beneath it, a sense that reality is no longer experienced directly, but through layers of interpretation. Media, technology, memory, language, each layer slightly reshaping the original experience. Over time, the world begins to feel less like a stable environment, and more like a constructed one, not necessarily false, but mediated, reconstructed continuously. And once that feeling emerges, even briefly, it can be difficult to fully unsee, because everyday life depends on trust in continuity, that yesterday leads into today without hidden breaks. That memory connects cleanly to the present, that the world remains fundamentally consistent beneath surface change. The Mandela effect gently interrupts that assumption, not by proving it wrong, but by introducing doubt at the edges. And doubt, once introduced into perception, does not fully disappear. It lingers quietly, sometimes unnoticed, sometimes returning unexpectedly when something familiar feels slightly off. Psychologically, the mind tries to restore stability. It explains. It categorizes. It searches for patterns that can resolve contradiction. And most of the time, it succeeds. Life continues. Reality feels solid again. But the memory of uncertainty remains in the background. A small trace, a reminder that perception is not infallible. There is also something paradoxical at the heart of the Mandela effect. The more people investigate it, the more examples they find. Not necessarily because reality is changing, but because attention becomes trained to notice inconsistency. Once the mind becomes sensitive to small discrepancies, it begins detecting them everywhere. In language, in symbols, in recollection, in expectation. And the world, always rich with variation and imperfection, begins to appear unstable. Yet even knowing this does not fully erase the sensation, because some memories feel too vivid to dismiss completely, too emotionally anchored, too widely shared. And so the tension remains unresolved, between explanation and experience, between certainty and doubt, between what is recorded and what is remembered. The Mandela effect exists entirely within that gap, and perhaps that is why it feels so persistent, not because it proves something extraordinary about reality, but because it reveals something ordinary about human consciousness that is rarely noticed directly. That perception is always partial. Memory is always reconstructive. And certainty is always more fragile than it appears. In the quiet moments, when external noise fades and thought turns inward, the question sometimes returns. Softly, uninvited. If so many people remember things differently, what else might memory be quietly reshaping without awareness? And in that question lies the true atmosphere of the Mandela effect. Not answers, but a lingering sense that reality, as experienced, is always slightly more uncertain than it first seems.